Good afternoon. I'm Amy Allen, Vice President at the Westchester County Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest episode of Business Insights, a new online video series jointly presented by the Westchester County Association and West Fair Communications, who, as many of you know, publish both the Westchester and the Fairfield County Business Journals. I am extremely excited about today's show. We have assembled an amazing group of healthcare experts who will share with us some of the cutting-edge scientific and medical and clinical research happening right here in our backyard. We are so fortunate here in Westchester to be home to so many world-class healthcare and life science institutions. From an economic perspective, it is far and away the most important sector in our region, providing over $18 billion in economic impact and employing well over 50,000. Not to mention the enormous positive impact on our collective health and well-being. But before we get to the show, I want to take a moment to thank the WCA Platinum Partners, without whose support we could not bring you programs like this one. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Amler, Dean of the School of Health Science and Practice and Vice President for Government Affairs at New York Medical College. Dr. Amler will share some of the extraordinary work underway at the college and will serve as moderator for the remainder of the show. Dr. Amler?
Well, thank you, Amy. And let's face it, everyone, we are all doing our best to protect against COVID. But still, everyone is asking, what have we learned so far? When will vaccines and treatments finally be here? The answer to both is research. And a lot of research, not surprisingly, is happening right here in Westchester. It's my privilege to be your moderator this afternoon, and we are all in for a treat because we have some excellent presentations coming right up. If you look at the screen, you'll see on my screen to your right is Dr. Rachel Grisham. Dr. Grisham is from Memorial Sloan Cancer Center in Westchester, where she is an expert on ovarian cancer and many other types of malignancies and their treatment. Dr. Donald Chen, who is hospital epidemiologist at Westchester Medical Center and WMC Health. And Asha Mellor, Northwell Health's Northern Westchester Hospital, where she is a supervisor for clinical research. We will get on to our excellent panel in just a few minutes, but first, I will give you a quick overview of where we are, and there you see again our panel. I just need a moment to bring my slides back. And there we are. So we'll say a few words first about innovations in research. And from New York Medical College right now here in Westchester, we have 3 programs that are prominent in this area. The BioInc Incubator that starts up small firms with innovative ideas in medical drugs, in new vaccine candidates, and even new medical devices and medical apps. The Center for Disaster Medicine, which does regular, ongoing research, service, training, and education in response and preparedness to all sorts of disasters, not just biological emergencies like the current one. And then finally, we sponsor some specific research and clinical trials right now in concert with many of our partners. Well, let's get started with what we already know or close to know. We know that COVID-19 spreads rapidly like a cold, but besides the mild cold symptoms, it can also be severe or even lethal. And we also know now over several months that older and the less healthy among us can be at greatest risk for the bad complications. We know that this has spread worldwide, and it has affected every state in our country. More importantly, we understand that in order to defeat this virus, we need to block exposure. We need to treat the disease when it happens. And most importantly, we want to prevent disease. But without technology, there's not much we can do of a top-notch nature. All we can do is basic common sense things, such as social distancing, hand washing and sanitizer, keeping hands off your face, avoiding coughs and sneezes, staying home, quarantine, isolation, etc. We've heard a great deal about this over the spring and summer. And if you think about it, with these techniques, we're not much better off than our predecessors were for centuries, going back as far as the Middle Ages and more recently in the 19th century, always hoping for something better than for this mom having to walk the floor all night with her sick baby. But in the last 100 years, we've developed life-saving technologies, and that's the topic for today. We already have sanitation, engineering, immunizations, antibiotics for a lot of conditions, other medications, imaging, medical surgical techniques, and nursing, and intensive care units. Let's put a human face on this. Here's a newborn baby. This newborn baby in 1900 had a 30% chance of dying in the first year of life, dying before the first birthday. But the same newborn born today has a better than 99% chance of living. And that's all because of technology. Here's an example of something that worked and worked well. You may think that half an ml of liquid, just a tenth of a teaspoon of liquid, 1/2 ml, can have a worldwide impact on humanity. And in fact, it did. Before this 1/2 ml was available, this is what we had in a Los Angeles hospital in 1952. It's about 2 generations ago, but the same hospital surge threat existed when large wards were filled with iron lungs and people in those iron lungs trying desperately to survive the ravages of polio, which paralyzed you from the waist down and sometimes from the chest down so that you could not breathe. But with that 1/2 ml developed in the mid-1950s, injected into the arms of children and adults, we were able to conquer polio. And once it was out there, people lined up in parking lots and around blocks, just like we expect they will when a COVID vaccine comes out. And worldwide, the same phenomenon has occurred. Did it work? Boy, it sure did. Here's what the world looked like on the left in 1988. You can see that the US and Canada and many of the Western countries were already free of polio. But by 2018, virtually the whole world, except for a few isolated areas, were free of polio, all because of what 1/2 ml did. Now, that first slide on the left, the first image on the left, took 30 years to accomplish. And on the right, that was another 30 years. But we have to hope that we're going to move a lot more quickly with the COVID vaccine and the other strategies once they evolve. So what do we have so far? We do know that technology will conquer COVID. It's a matter of time, it's a matter of technique, it's a matter of perseverance. But the first three, enhanced testing, contact tracing, and various telestrategies, are already here. We're already putting them to work. The next step is getting effective antiviral medications, immunizations, both passive and active, more on that in a moment, and more sophisticated data analyses so that we can see where we're going and what it's going to take to reach that finish line. Well, we already have an entire family of telestrategies. Excuse me. Over here, already on the tele level, we have ability to work at home. We can do virtual meetings like the one we're all in now. Online shopping, many of these examples of things we've only developed in the last few months to the level of accomplishment that we have today. In a sense, they were brewing for a while, but now we've made them really work. And I think many of you would agree, these meetings, these home working strategies are working for large numbers of people. You will also hear a great deal in the next few minutes about research that's underway right here in Westchester. For example, at New York Medical College, here at New York Medical College, we have some 7, actually more than that now, different studies in progress. One of them involves Dr. Chen, who you're going to hear from in a minute, and a marvelous company here in Westchester, Regeneron, which you've read a great deal about, I know. You're going to hear a lot about some of these clinical trials that are currently at New York Medical College. And as the quest for that wonderful pill or that great injection or that great vaccine proceeds, we need to realize that development of medications takes time. We need to make sure that they're safe, that they're efficacious, that we have the right doses, and we know when to give them. Some medicines have to be given right when you first get sick. Others can be given later, and some only given when you're really seriously ill. That needs to be worked out. There are approvals, something called fill and finish, to make sure that the right medicine goes into the right vial for the right patient and the like. And we also know that the quest for vaccines is in full tilt right now. 2 types of immunization. The first is passive, in which we transfer antibodies from someone who already has antibodies to someone who just got sick with convalescent plasma, something called monoclonal antibodies. And active immunization, where we actually stimulate the recipient to make their own antibodies, such as with a vaccine. But it's going to take millions, hundreds of millions, even billions of doses, and we still don't know even if a single dose will be enough to solve the problem, or if we have to give second doses. So that's where we are right now. And we're going to find out a great deal more about what's happening in Westchester with the speakers that will follow me. But in conclusion, I can tell you today that the conquest of COVID is depending on technology at many different levels. Some are here, some we're working on, and some will come in a few more months. But Westchester is well positioned to be very much in play in making these changes happen. And already businesses and social norms are adapting, and adapting fairly well to adjust to what some people call a new normal. This learning curve is going to be vital because technology has, does, and will save lives, millions at a time. I appreciate your listening to my little example of 1/2 ml, which I think is a great story. And we're going to now move on to the panel. Let me reintroduce the first speaker on the panel. And as we shift over to Dr. Chen's appearance, let me remind you that this is an interactive webinar. And so if you have questions, if you'd like some clarifications, you can post them at the bottom of your screen below the video, and we will be reviewing them throughout the webinar, and we will select and post some of the most relevant questions for our panelists. But now on to our first panelist, and that is, once again, Dr. Donald Chen, epidemiologist for Westchester Medical Center and WMC Health, a good friend and colleague. Dr. Chen, take it away.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amler, and I'm pleased to be here today. For our viewers, please note that I will not be presenting slides with my talk today. Westchester Medical Center is a highly specialized center delivering care to the residents of the Hudson Valley and beyond. And as you can imagine, with the COVID outbreak and surge that occurred in March and April and May, where the epicenter was New York City, we saw a large number of fairly complicated and ill patients with COVID. So our challenge then, as these patients came to our hospital, was how best to treat these patients. We learned in medical school and training beyond about evidence-based practice, which is the idea that we develop more and more knowledge on which treatments work for patients at what doses, with which other combination drugs with them, and for which types of patients. And this is a process by which, through measured study and trials, the ideas of what is the best medication are refined over and over again in an iterative process. Now, with COVID-19, this is a new infection that hadn't been seen on the globe till quite recently in humans. So we're in a position where there were no proven or approved FDA therapies for COVID-19, and there were also promising medications that were proposed, but there was not real data to say that these worked or they didn't work. So with that in mind, our goals here at this hospital were to first be able to provide access to our patients for therapies that may be potentially beneficial and potentially life-saving. And second, in doing so, contribute to that body of knowledge so that we can determine for future patients what works and what works best for the treatment of COVID. So with those goals in mind, I'd like to highlight some of the research endeavors that have occurred here at Westchester Medical Center on COVID in the past number of months. The first is the sarilumab study that Dr. Amler already referred to. This is a multi-center trial with Regeneron, of which Westchester Medical Center partnered with New York Medical College to be one of the enrolling and participating sites. We quickly ramped up and we quickly enrolled patients who are eligible in this study. The study is premised on the hypothesis that with COVID-19, some patients who get very ill and have trouble getting enough oxygen into their lungs and into their blood are so ill because of tissue damage that's actually related to the immune response, to the body's own immune and inflammatory response. So in effect, it's some collateral damage caused by one's own immune system, not necessarily the virus itself, making this subset of patients very ill. So sarilumab is a medication that was already approved for rheumatoid arthritis that works on a pathway called interleukin-6 or IL-6. It blocks that pathway, which mediates inflammation, and by blocking that pathway, it turns down the immune response in patients with COVID, with the idea that by turning it down, these patients may recover better, have less severe disease, and go on to do better and with less mortality. So we enrolled the patients in this study, and we did that over a number of weeks and months, as did many other centers throughout the country and elsewhere. The enrollment has closed, and Regeneron has analyzed the data, and so far they have found that this medication, sarilumab, did not show benefit to the patients who received it. That's not the result we wanted, but that's okay because this is the process of clinical trials. The trial was done as a randomized clinical trial, meaning that we had patients who got the drug, patients who got placebo, and the investigators and the patients did not know which one they got. So it's the best form of evidence to determine whether something is effective or not. And by doing this, we add to the knowledge, and we will then in the future be able to refine what are the correct treatments. Not every medication works, but there are some that do, and this is how we go about it. The next study I want to talk about is also for therapy. It's for convalescent plasma. Dr. Amler has referred to this. It's a passive transfer of antibodies by taking a fraction of the blood of a recovered COVID patient that's rich in antibodies against COVID, and then administering that to patients who have the COVID disease, with the idea that these antibodies will then attenuate the disease and help promote recovery and prevent more severe disease. We participated in a nationwide expanded access program so that our patients could receive this antibody transfer in the form of plasma. And in doing so as part of a study, meaning that information was collected on these patients and their outcomes to allow the Mayo Clinic, who sponsored this, to learn more about whether and how and to what effect these antibody transfers benefited our patients. There are other studies I'd like to talk about and other contributions that have been made at Westchester Medical Center. As we went through the COVID surge in March and April, and as it started to calm down in April and May, we started to see kids come to our hospital with a new syndrome that's now been termed multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, or MISC. This affects children by affecting their gastrointestinal tract, their cardiac system, their skin, their eyes, and they come in with a post-infectious inflammatory disorder where it's, again, not the virus itself that's causing the issues, but the immune system. We saw a number of these patients, and our astute clinicians picked this up, and they have contributed to 2 seminal articles published in the New England Journal of Medicine describing and characterizing this new syndrome. These 2 articles dealt with a series of children from New York State with MISC, as well as a series of children from the United States with MISC. And then finally, we have investigators and clinicians in a number of our departments and divisions who have contributed to the literature their specific observations and findings in case series of patients who have presented with syndromes and symptoms that are not classed for COVID and a bit unusual. And we also have individuals in our departments who have contributed to the literature in their techniques and methods they've developed to help keep the staff safe in performing specialized procedures in patients with COVID-19. So I'm proud to say that we have been a contributor to furthering the field of COVID-19 research, and that in doing so, we've been able to take care of our patients, provide them access to medications that are potentially beneficial, and contribute to the knowledge so that future patients with COVID can benefit and receive the best treatments available. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Dr. Amler.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Very insightful comments, and so important that we're looking at this syndrome in children as well, which we don't really know enough about quite yet. So very, very important work, and thank you. Our next panelist, Dr. Rachel Grisham, as I've mentioned before, is an expert in female reproductive cancers, but especially ovarian cancer. She is at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer, Westchester, which most of you are probably already aware is part of the overall Memorial Sloan Kettering system based in Manhattan, but with very significant facilities now in other locations, including, as I understand, 2 in Westchester. And Dr. Grisham is going to speak next. Dr. Grisham?
Thanks so much, Dr. Amler, for the introduction. Yes, my name is Rachel Grisham, and I'm Associate Attending Physician of Gynecologic Medical Oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. There I'm the Section Head of Ovarian Cancer Treatment and the Director of Gynecologic Medical Oncology at MSKCC Westchester. MSKCC Westchester is one of our largest of our 6 main regional sites, and where we offer medical oncology, radiation oncology, procedures through interventional radiology, surgical oncology, as well as multiple supportive practices such as dermatology, psychiatry, acupuncture, pain management, and of course, chemotherapy infusion, blood transfusions, phlebotomy, and access to our clinical trial network. Over the past few years, we've seen a trend in our patients wishing to be treated closer to home. And in order to provide them with the same level of care at our regional network as at our main hospital in Manhattan, we have developed a system where our regional network really mirrors the same level of care that we provide at our main site in Manhattan. We have many of the same oncologists practicing at both sites, the same surgeons. We have centralized radiology, laboratory testing, and also a centralized clinical trial team so that patients can enroll on clinical trials across our regional network. With the surge in COVID-19 in this past spring, there was, of course, an increase in patients wishing to be treated closer to home. At MSKCC Westchester, we've worked really hard to welcome those patients and allow them to receive their treatment in a safe and efficient fashion closer to home. Our first efforts when the virus first hit were to make sure that we could provide for the safety of both our patients and our providers while allowing them to receive the treatment that they so urgently need for their cancer. We very early on adapted a universal face mask policy requiring both patients and providers to wear face masks at all times when inside, as well as providers wearing face shields or face goggles whenever interacting with patients. Our visitor policy has evolved during the time of the pandemic, at one point allowing all patients to come in alone, and now allowing for visitors in specific situations, really with the emphasis being on having as few additional people on site as necessary to safely provide care to our patients. We have screening health checks for all of our patients prior to arrival in clinic, and all providers fill out a virtual health check every morning before reporting to work. We've quickly built up our testing platform to allow us to efficiently use testing. We have an RNA PCR test, which is processed internally, with results generally returning within 12 hours. We use this to screen, of course, any of our symptomatic patients, as well as patients with recent exposures, as well as patients undergoing procedures, surgery, or being admitted to our hospital. We also screen our inpatients to prevent spread of nosocomial infection, and also allow this testing to be used to screen our providers. The expansion of telemedicine has allowed us to successfully triage those patients who can be treated successfully from home without having to report on site. But of course, when the virus first hit, those patients that really needed chemotherapy for treatment of their disease were left with a lot of questions and uncertainty about, was it safe to receive chemotherapy for their cancer with the new virus? There's been different data from China and other institutions that have reported mixed results as to the impact of chemotherapy on outcomes in patients with COVID-19. We, of course, wanted to learn more about this so that we could provide our patients with the most up-to-date information and so that they could make informed decisions about whether to receive treatment for their cancer. In order to address these issues, our group at Sloan Kettering has reported on 2 recent studies based on our patient population and shown what we've learned about how COVID-19 affects those patients on chemotherapy for cancer. The first study that I'll discuss was published in JCO in August of this year. This was a retrospective study of 309 patients treated at Sloan Kettering who had confirmed COVID-19 that was diagnosed between March 8th, the date that our first patient was diagnosed, and March 31st of this year. These patients were compared to a matched population of 917 of our patients at Sloan Kettering without COVID-19. We found that the mean time from start of symptoms to development of severe or critical event in those patients who had a severe or critical event was 12.6 days. 33% of the patients had received cytotoxic chemotherapy within 5 weeks of their COVID-19 diagnosis. We found no association between chemotherapy within those 5 weeks and the development of severe or critical illness. The number of patients who received immunotherapy in this study was small, 18 patients, but there was not associated with severe or critical illness. Patients with hematologic cancer such as leukemia and primary lung cancer, cancer originating in the lung, as opposed to cancer metastatic to the lung, were associated with development of severe or critical illness. We also published a separate study, which was published in Nature Medicine in June, which looked at a larger population of our patients. This study looked at 946 patients treated at Sloan Kettering between March 10th and May 7th of this year. Similar to other studies, age, cardiac disease, hypertension, and chronic kidney disease were correlated with severe outcomes. However, receipt of chemotherapy or major surgery within 30 days before COVID-19 diagnosis was not associated with a higher risk of complications. In this study, which looked at a larger number of patients, treatment with immunotherapy did predict for both hospitalization and severe disease. This remains an active question as there have been some conflicting reports and a heterogeneous population of patients treated with immunotherapy. Immunotherapy is commonly used to treat primary lung cancer, which in itself is a risk factor for developing more severe side effects from the virus. It's a question we're still working to more efficiently answer. Luckily, COVID-19 amongst our pediatric patients with cancer did exhibit a milder course, consistent with reports in children without cancer. Really, our takeaway message is that it is important that we have continued diligence with masks, hand washing, social distancing to avoid the spread of COVID-19, both to our families, but also to our most vulnerable populations. However, patients should continue to perform recommended cancer screening and report new symptoms to their physicians, as we want patients to avoid being diagnosed at a late stage or missing out on potentially curative treatment. Available data thus far from MSKCC does not show an association between receipt of chemotherapy and worse outcomes with COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grisham. And what an interesting perspective, not just for patients who need their cancer treatment, but for the general, presumably healthy population who may not get their cancer screening on time because they're afraid to come in or they're worried about COVID exposure. And is it even more frustrating to think that a loved one could succumb to cancer because they didn't go in for that critical screening or that critical follow-up test? So something we all need to bear in mind, whether we have cancer, a family with cancer, a family member with cancer, or none. So thank you very much. Very insightful, very interesting work. Our third panelist is Asha Mellor, who is in charge of clinical trials for a very significant community hospital branch of Northwell Health. We all know Northwell Health, a very large health system in the New York area, I believe the largest in the state, and probably in the Northeast. And Northern Westchester Hospital, one of our really excellent community hospitals, just a little bit to the north of the county. Asha Mellor.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Amler. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm Asha Mellor, the Administrative Director of Clinical Research here at Northern Westchester Hospital. Unlike my fellow panelists, I'm not a physician. I'm more on the operations and implementation side of things. When COVID-19 hit New York, all of Northwell's research efforts pivoted from other disease states to COVID-19. We stopped opening non-COVID trials, and non-critical studies were placed in a holding pattern so that we could free up the research staff, the institutional review board, the contracts department, the clinical trials office to focus solely on getting COVID-19 studies up and running. For already active studies, non-treatment visits were done as televisits or by phone. We restricted on-site monitoring for the trials that were still open. And we worked round the clock. The FDA even met with some of the Northwell team on a Saturday to make things happen very quickly. The first study opened within the Northwell system was sponsored by Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, as we all know, is based here in Westchester. That study was able to be opened within 4 days from receipt of the protocol to being open for enrollment. Northwell went on to open several other studies using remdesivir, tradipitant, famotidine, convalescent plasma, which we've heard about, mainly at Lenox Hill Hospital, North Shore University Hospital, and LIJ. We were able to, with this new streamlined system and the amazing leadership from Northwell and right here at Northern Westchester Hospital, we were able to get 3 of those trials here to Westchester and up and running in a span of 8 days. Normally you have weeks, sometimes months in advance of a study opening to train the other departments involved, laboratory staff how to process the samples, and you can, sorry, my slide slipped. We also normally train the nursing staff and the pharmacy, and we had 8 days to get that all done, and we managed to get it together. So the 3 trials that we brought up was the MATCH study, which looked at a combination of hydroxychloroquine with famotidine or just hydroxychloroquine on its own. The Expanded Access Program, and the Odyssey trial, which was looking at tradipitant. to treat the inflammation and improve the symptoms. One of the biggest challenges we came across was just how to manage the consent process for trials. We wanted to get as many subjects into the trials as were willing and who qualified, but that we needed to be very concerned about contamination. They sign the consent form. That consent form is now contaminated. It needs to be put in biohazard bags and handled very carefully. Normally, it would be immediately scanned into the electronic medical record. So we had to find ways around that. Also, if you're consenting somebody who is intubated or critically ill and can't consent on their own, in a normal situation, you can usually find the family members either at the bedside or in the lounge, or they can come to the hospital to sign a consent in person. And because of the no visitation rules, we were not able to do this. So we had to come up with new processes. There were three-way phone calls followed by informed consent being emailed, signed, returned, scanned back, or sometimes even a photograph being taken of it. So it really was a great challenge for us to get all that done. Sorry, my clicker's not working. So in addition to the trials that we were running, we also had to get set up for the onslaught of patients. We opened a field hospital here at Northern Westchester Hospital in our north parking lot. It could house 30 to 40 patients, has the same equipment, staffing, and supplies as units within the walls of the hospital. Fortunately, we have not needed to treat any patients within the field hospital to this point, but we are going to leave it in place until the fall or later if we need it. Hopefully, of course, we won't. We also set up an acute ventilator recovery unit here at Northern Westchester Hospital that allowed us to take vented patients from ICUs at other locations and bring them here and free up the ICU beds in other locations as well as in our own ICU. Okay, so we did a lot of testing, just like the other institutions here. We did a total of 16,796 here at Northern Westchester Hospital. Unique patients, meaning not retests, was 729. And we had inpatient COVID positive encounters of 441 patients and outpatient positives at 540. We also made antibody testing available to our staff, to first responders and other essential workers on May 14th, and then COVID-19 antibody testing for community members became available on June 10th. The total antibody tests performed were 787 to date. So we've got other things going on that are new here in Westchester. We're trying to bring all of the technology from other Northwell sites and all of the new innovations up here to Westchester to make it available for our patients in this area. One of the new things, Dr. Ranjana Chatterjee, a breast surgeon here from our breast care center, was the first in the state to use MagTrace dye to map the lymph nodes in breast cancer patients to hopefully avoid taking out lymph nodes unnecessarily. We've also got over at Phelps, Dr. Dina Katz, a cardiologist, who's teaming up with our Lenox Hill Hospital gang in a registry study in patients with a recent cardiovascular event and looking at PCSK9 drugs to hopefully prevent further events. We also, very exciting, have a new cath center, cath lab opening here at Northern Westchester Hospital in September. And we're planning on doing a lot of clinical trials and device studies in the cath lab. There is a webinar that you can go to if you'd like to meet the experts and get a sneak peek of the state-of-the-art cath lab. It is truly lovely. I'm looking forward to doing lots of research in there. Coming soon to both Northern Westchester Hospital and Phelps, studies in MDS, radiation therapy trials, optical imaging cancer study, bladder cancer trials, and hopefully much more that we can disclose soon. We've got ongoing research in the following areas. And of course, continuing with coronavirus, should that be necessary in the future. Thank you very much. I'll give it back to Dr. Amler.
Presentation. So interesting that research continues for COVID, but also for a wide variety of other diseases. Biomedical research is biomedical research, and on any day, you never know, which finding, which discovery is going to lead us to better treatments, better prevention, and overall better health. I want to thank each of the panelists before we go on to the question session. Dr. Rachel Grisham, Dr. Donald Chen, Asha Mellor, thank you so much. Appreciate your time. And Dr. Chen, since you were the first panelist, first to speak, can I present a first question? And before I do, is there anything else you were going to add that you didn't have a chance to mention?
No, thank you. That's fine.
Great. So the first question really is, since we recognize that COVID-19 is still here, has not disappeared, what do you feel are the major research needs at this particular juncture in time?
Well, thank you for that question. I think the main need and the game changer would be something like a vaccine to help it go away or get down to very low levels worldwide. In addition to that, there's also a need for more studies on treatments that are effective to give us more of an armamentarium to treat this infection. And finally, not to be overlooked, getting to public health, we need to better understand how it's transmitted, how readily it's transmitted, and what are the predictors of infectiousness? Who are the ones who are very infectious that we would want to pay special attention to so that they don't transmit it to more other people? Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Grisham, next question for you. Do you still have, a lot of people want to know about clinical trials, do you still have therapeutic oncology clinical trials open and adding patients currently in the Westchester facility of MSKCC?
Thank you, Dr. Amler, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I've loved listening to everybody's presentations and so informative. We do. The vast majority of our therapeutic clinical trials are open and enrolling patients. It's been very important to us to keep those going so that we can provide the best care possible to our patients. We have, of course, made modifications to allow for patient safety, such as e-consenting and decrease of unnecessary visits. But it is our goal to keep those trials up and running.
Well, I'm sure that's good news to a lot of people who want to know what's available out there. So thank you for that response. And speaking of clinical trials, Asha Mellor, you mentioned earlier that your outside tent is still up and could be still operational, if I understand correctly. So do you think we might have a resurgence of COVID? And importantly, will you have new trials up and running if there is a resurgence?
If there is a resurgence, which we of course all hope we don't see, we are ready for whatever comes at us. Depending on where the science is at the point where there is a resurgence, if that happens, we will open whatever new trials we think our patients can benefit from. We're ready for it. We've got the technology and we've got the equipment in place, and we're going to do everything we can to help patients get into trials and find treatment.
Good answer and good news again for people who are watching. Dr. Chen, back to you. The next question. With respect to research and innovation, what made for successes at your institution at Westchester Medical Center?
What made for successes here are actually quite similar to the points that Asha covered, which is that leadership and others in the hospitals and the IRB realized the importance of these studies and how they needed to start very quickly. So these studies were expedited in a similar fashion to as Asha described at her institution. But furthermore, it wasn't just the leadership, it was also the commitment of all the individuals here. Many people stepped up to do whatever they could to participate to help move these projects along. So I would say it was really a team effort, and it was a commitment of the people involved, recognizing the need at hand. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Grisham, the next question. Again, kind of a tough one. Do you have a plan in place if there is a resurgence of COVID?
Thank you. Yes, of course, we all hope that there will not be, but we fear that there may be a resurgence in the fall. We've really learned a lot from the period in the spring when the virus first hit this area, and during that time built up our supplies of personal protective equipment, developed our testing platform, and have tried to learn as much as possible so that we are ready if the virus does surge again in this area. I think the most important thing is that the availability of testing will be extremely important in order to contain it if it is surging again in this area.
Thank you. I'm watching the clock, and I think we have time for a few more questions. Asha Mellor, you sort of said this already, but someone wanted to know, are you still enrolling a lot of patients into trials?
Actually, we are fortunately not seeing enough inpatient admissions of COVID patients, which is the trials that we had open. So we are not currently enrolling many patients at all because, thank goodness, we're really not having too many hospitalized right now.
Thank you. And now I see we have some additional questions that just came in from the audience, and this one is posted. I'm going to pick on my fellow epidemiologist here, Dr. Chen. Can you comment on the concept of herd immunity?
Yes, thank you. So the concept of herd immunity is that if enough persons in the population have immunity to the infection, in this case COVID-19, then that would prevent its spread throughout the population such that even those who are not immune are still protected because they wouldn't be exposed to it, or they'd be less likely to be exposed to it. Herd immunity can be accomplished either through natural infection. If natural infection leads to long-standing immunity afterward, and that's a question that still needs to be answered. Herd immunity could also be accomplished through enough persons being vaccinated and having immunity through vaccination.
And either way, we have to hope that some of that kicks into play. Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard a 3-hour answer condensed into 60 seconds or less. So that was an excellent answer. You could write textbooks on herd immunity. I think we may have one more question from there it is. There's been conflicting opinions recently about testing if you're asymptomatic. Who do you feel should be tested and how frequently? And which tests are most reliable? And Dr. Grisham, do you want to take that and see if anybody else has some answers too? The question again about who should be tested and what's the reliability of testing for COVID?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different answers and different opinions here, but I would see it as a prioritization of resources. In many parts of this country, it's still actually quite hard to get a test done in a timely manner, which can be difficult. So for those patients that are only going to have an opportunity to be tested once, obviously we should prioritize those patients with acute symptoms and really be using that resource mindfully. However, the goal should really be to build up our testing capabilities so that we don't have to prioritize the testing to just the symptomatic patients, as it was in the very beginning when we were seeing those positivity rates of 25-30%, because only the very sickest patients were being tested. Once we have enough testing capabilities, we can then expand testing to positive contacts, and then down the line to asymptomatic screening. At Sloan Kettering, we have built up a strong testing platform and do have ample resources available, which does allow us to screen our providers in order to have the lowest risk of transmission to our susceptible patients as possible. But really, it's dependent upon the individual area and what resources they have available.
Thank you. And once again, folks, you just heard a very succinct answer to a very complex question. Asha Mellor, do you have anything else to say about testing in terms of your people going into clinical trials?
We do test patients who are in trials who are coming in to be seen on site. They need to be tested within 72 hours of coming to be seen here at the hospital. And then again, I believe currently we're looking at every 21 days of retesting if patients are coming in for trials or for other treatments.
And another question has just come in from the audience. It's posting now. There have been, now this is the last question that we just saw. Is there another question? Not seeing it yet. We'll give it another minute. Okay, I'm told it's coming. It's on the way. Wait for it. Wait for it. Okay. This is a lob over the plate for Dr. Chen. So we're going to pick on you once again, our epidemiologist. How infectious is a person who is asymptomatic? Easy question.
This is a question that is not so easy and straightforward. The answer to this question has been evolving since COVID first appeared. Initially, it was felt that asymptomatic individuals were not infectious and not contagious, probably based on corollary analogy to other respiratory viral infections. But with time, with studies from other countries and later on studies here, it became evident that persons could be asymptomatic and infectious. It's felt to be a window of roughly about 2 days before symptom onset for those who become symptomatic or infectious. And there's still debate as to the relative contributions of asymptomatic persons leading to more transmissions versus symptomatic persons. You would think that symptomatic persons, because they're coughing, sneezing, would have more opportunities to spread the disease via the droplets and potentially aerosols. But asymptomatics might also be generating aerosols through everyday activities, and because there could be more asymptomatics that are not identified, they could certainly serve as a significant reservoir for transmission as well.
Thank you very much. I'll add my own question and then we will wrap up. If we were a Major League Baseball team going into the World Series, who would be the 3 best panelists to put up to bat so we get grand slams and win the series? And I'll answer my own question. They are the 3 panelists you just heard from. So my own applaud for you guys, and thank you so much. I'm going to ask Amy Allen, our Vice President for the Westchester County Association, to do the final wrap-up. And thank you all for the privilege of being your moderator. I think you might be muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry. Anyway, you get a second thank you because I thanked you all. I was muted. So thank you, Dr. Amler, and thank you again to those amazing speakers. It really was incredibly enlightening, and it's certainly clear to me, and I think probably to everyone watching, that Westchester is most definitely an exciting hub of innovation and research in healthcare and life sciences. And certainly it's a sector that we at the Westchester County Association will continue to wholeheartedly support. I'd like to thank again our Platinum partners. And as with all of our virtual programming, this one will be available on demand through our LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube channels. So once again, thank you to our panel and thank you to all who are watching. Be well and stay safe.